The Spin-off Podcast Network. This podcast was made with the support of New Zealand On Air.
One of the things that made the day even more dramatic was the weather. It was the worst that Wellington can throw at you. High winds, rain, low temperatures.
It's a dark and stormy night. You got a thunderbolt there, Te Aihe?
A thunderbolt.
Go on.
Okay.
It's Monday, July the 16th, 1984. 2 days after a wild snap election delivered a momentous victory for David Lange's Labour over Rob Muldoon's National Party. Lange will later call this day the most extraordinary of his life in politics, and at this point, he hasn't even been sworn in as Prime Minister. 40 years on, we're shuttling back to this seismic moment in New Zealand political history, with the help of the people who were in the room.
He was engaging in a scorched earth policy. He thought that he'd psych us out.
I can give him some instruction in the realities of government.
Both ends of that middle income have been attacked savagely.
There's going to be bankruptcies, but by God, it's sensible stuff.
Bitter attacks on the government.
Time is running out. Options are closing.
Tēnā koutou katoa. I'm Toby Manhire for the Spin-off Podcast Network, and this is Juggernaut, the story of the Fourth Labour government. Episode 2, The Nation is at Risk.
Well, I'm Richard Harman. Television New Zealand called me the chief political correspondent, and I worked for primarily Eyewitness News, which was a news current affairs show that went out about 9:30 at night.
Okay, let's set the scene. Rob Muldoon has been fuming since election night. He spent much of the Sunday afterwards in his beehive office, crouched like a wounded lion in his lair, according to the head of the Prime Minister's department. Through the election campaign, currency had flooded out of the country. Remember, at this point, exchange rates in New Zealand are fixed. They're fixed by the state. And with Muldoon having moved to freeze just about everything, the value of the New Zealand dollar has drifted seriously out of whack. So a bunch of people have moved their money out of the country, confidently betting on a Labour win and a devaluation. Then they can swap their money back and suddenly be richer. Muldoon had agreed on the Sunday night to suspend all foreign exchange dealings. His precise words, in response to pleas from the bosses of the Reserve Bank and the Treasury, "Do whatever you like." But he would not agree to a devaluation. He's officially still the Prime Minister, remember. He's officially still the Finance Minister, and he will not budge. Word has begun to spill out.
By lunchtime, I knew there was a crisis, and it was a pretty big one. So I was a bit surprised when I looked at television and the 6 o'clock news, and Dick Griffin, who was chair of the gallery, said, well, there's going to be no more comment on what's going to happen. And I thought, well, that didn't sound right to me, that Muldoon was a very accessible Prime Minister. There'd been nothing. No one had said anything in public. So we got hold of Muldoon's office, and they were told to go out to Vogel House, where he lived. And I realised that this was going to be pretty big, and I was somewhat impatient to get there. And the cameraman that was with me had tickets to the Wellington Film Festival, which was on at the same time, and he insisted that we drive from Petricorp House down by Parliament to Vogel House via Courtenay Place in the Paramount Theatre so that he could sell his tickets to that night's film. Well, I was not very happy about this. And finally we get to the Paramount Theatre, and I grabbed the tickets out of his hand, threw them out the window, and gave him $5 and said, right, that's settled, let's just get going. And we did, and we got out to Vogel House. And Thea Muldoon answered the door. There was no police there or anything. He was just him and his wife. And he turned up without any shoes on, which was a bit unusual. But he found some shoes and put them on, and we sat down, and then he made it clear that although there was a crisis, he was going to reject all the official advice on how to handle that crisis. There was a run on the currency, but he was not going to do anything about that.
I am not going to devalue as long as I'm Minister of Finance.
The camera zooms into a very tight close-up of Muldoon. From time to time, he looks directly into the lens.
If Mr. Lange has got any sense at all, And up until this moment on this thing, he has not displayed it. He will come out with me and say, we will not devalue the New Zealand dollar. He only has to say that tonight, and I can assure you that everything else will fall into place.
We were so stunned by the interview, or at least I was, that we didn't bother to shoot any back cuts or cutaways or anything. We just thought, let's get this back as fast as we can. And on the way back into Wellington, because we didn't have cell phones, we radioed the office, told them what was in the interview and said, you've got to get hold of Lange immediately.
So they rush back down State Highway 2 and play Lange the tape. The Muldoon interview airs on Eyewitness News at 9:30 p.m, directly after Falcon Crest. And then Lange is on to respond, live.
This Prime Minister, outgoing, beaten, has in the course of one television interview tried to do more damage to the New Zealand economy than any statement ever made. He has actually alerted the world to a crisis. And like King Canute, he stands there and says, everyone is wrong but me.
I think he goes for over a minute without any interruption in what I think is one of the most powerful pieces of television and oratory that I've ever seen. And it was like someone had just hit me with a hammer in the studio.
In fact, Lange goes for 4.5 minutes. It's remarkable. He's viscerally outraged. It's incredible television, incredible politics.
This nation is at risk. That is how basic it is. And I am concerned to think that there is a person at the titular head who is behaving in such a bizarre and irresponsible fashion.
And that was only the beginning of the night.
Harman, who these days runs the site politic.co.nz, meets up with a friend from the Dominion newspaper.
We were desperate for a drink, understandably. And the bars were closed. And we thought, well, we'll just go for a walk around the beehive, see whether there's any gnats in there. And we got to Jim McLay's office. And we just walked straight in. There was no one to stop us. And there they all were, most of the cabinet sitting around. But most importantly, you could see that what was on the floor were copies of the New Zealand Constitution Act open. So we knew then that Muldoon, there was going to be a coup if he didn't do something.
I'm Jim McLay. I'm a former Member of Parliament and former Deputy Prime Minister and Leader of the Opposition. And a former a lot of things.
While Lange is preparing to go on camera in the Beehive studio at 9:30, the Deputy Prime Minister is in his office, oblivious to what is going on a few floors below. The phone rings.
In those days, ministerial offices didn't even have a television set. And my wife rang me and said, you better listen to this. And she held the telephone up to the TV.
Devalue. I am not going to devalue so long as I'm Minister of Finance.
I was astonished. The Cabinet had met that morning, very much a perfunctory affair, because we didn't have much business, any business to transact of substance. Muldoon had told the Cabinet that officials were still advising for a valuation and that he did not agree. And that was about all that was said. As far as I was concerned, it wasn't for us. We had been rejected, and therefore the matter was for the incoming government. The only complication was that the new government couldn't be sworn in for about another 10 days. And if there were decisions to be carried forward into implementation, we had to do it. But that wasn't even discussed.
Pretty much as soon as McLay puts down the phone, a young backbench MP, Simon Upton, turns up at his door. Upton, who these days is the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, wants to know if the Deputy PM has heard this extraordinary Muldoon interview and what he plans to do about it.
First of all, we had to ascertain what the constitutional position was.
This is the scene that Richard Harman observes when he walks past the office looking for a drink.
There'd been just an automatic assumption that if there had to be action during the interregnum period, then the outgoing government would have to carry it forward and have no responsibility for the decision. But we couldn't find any precedent for that, and there was no precedent, simply because no one had ever called it to question before. We then agreed, however, that we would do the work on behalf of the incoming government if that was necessary. And we proceeded then on that basis. The next thing we had to do was to talk with the government's economic advisors to find out what the implications of this were.
As if enough weren't already going on this particular stormy night, the top brass of the New Zealand economy are all at the annual dinner of the Bankers Association at a restaurant called Le Normandie, a stone's throw from the Bucket Fountain on Cuba Mall. Spencer Russell of the Reserve Bank and Bernie Galvin from Treasury are there. So is Gerald Hensley, head of the Prime Minister's Department. McLay and his colleagues get on the phone.
We had a bit of a problem because we got the wrong gender, and we were looking for La Normandie rather than Le Normandie. And we chided Templeton, the scholar amongst us, for not knowing his French.
The crowd at the restaurant are starting to get word of this explosive Muldoon interview.
They couldn't confer in the main body of the restaurant, so they went into the bathroom. Russell was the most senior of their group, so he was given the seat, if you can imagine that. And they were discussing the matter when our call came through. They gave us some information about the state of the economy and, more correctly, the state of the foreign reserves and the risk of a run on the New Zealand dollar. There was a risk of a financial crisis, an economic crisis, and that there was also, of course, as we knew, a constitutional crisis. We then tried to get hold of Muldoon. That proved difficult. We rang. The phone just rang and gave no indication of anything. Turned out later that Lady Muldoon was sick of the phone calls and had taken the phone off the hook. Muldoon was watching Hill Street Blues, which was one of his favourite television programmes.
The plan they settle on before leaving the Beehive in the early hours of July 17th is essentially this. If Muldoon doesn't buckle and go along with Lange's request for a devaluation, they're going to roll him, and McLay will take on the position of caretaker Prime Minister.
We agreed that I would advise the Governor-General that Muldoon had lost the confidence of at least his senior colleagues and invite him to appoint me as Prime Minister pro tem, that I would give an undertaking that we would act on the instructions of the Labour government and do nothing else. I also told some of my colleagues that in the event that course of action had to be followed, I would not be a contender for the leadership of the National Party. I didn't want there to be any suggestion that we had mounted what would be regarded as almost a palace coup.
The next morning, McLay speaks to the Governor-General's secretary and lays it all out. He confers with the Solicitor General. Shortly after 8 a.m, he takes a deep breath and heads for the 9th floor to confront the Prime Minister.
I knew that was about the time he arrived and I wanted to see him immediately. I was talking with Ken Richardson, his senior private secretary. When Muldoon arrived at the office, he barged past me straight in, didn't greet anybody. Ken Richardson told me years later that he was astonished at the way he reacted towards me at that moment. I then went to sought an audience with him and saw him a couple of minutes later. And I told him that his senior colleagues were concerned at his statement regarding the devaluation issue and that there was a convention that we had to act upon. He argued Lange didn't know what he was talking about. He had no experience of the economy, whereas Muldoon did. I said, none of that is now relevant. Lange has won the right to lead the government and we must hand over the reins of power accordingly. The discussion went on for some time and it was very testy. I'm still reluctant really to talk too much about it because I was embarrassed at the fact that the leader of the party that I had served in Parliament was behaving in this way.
Behaving in what way?
Well, the simple fact that he was seen to be not accepting the result of the election. That was my concern.
Let's pause on this. What we have here is the Deputy Prime Minister of New Zealand facing up to the Prime Minister in the Prime Minister's office because the Prime Minister appears not to be accepting the result of the election. And what McLay does is he tells Muldoon that there is a constitutional convention that the outgoing administration basically has to do as the incoming government wishes. It's kind of a bluff. Finally, Muldoon capitulates.
So we agreed that there would be a cabinet meeting at 9 o'clock that morning at which I expounded the constitutional convention that I had drafted. And I drafted that statement or that summary of the convention as I saw it because I didn't want him to resile from the discussion we just had. And I was determined that we had to nail this down very explicitly. And I released that as a press statement shortly after the Cabinet had met. The Cabinet didn't actually make a decision at that time. It was simply informed of the position.
Muldoon would later dispute that there had ever been a constitutional crisis, insisting that he'd just been waiting for Lange's advice in writing and wanted it known that he disagreed. But the convention articulated by McLay, the Caretaker Convention, endures today.
It's actually written into our Cabinet manual. It's been copied into other Cabinet manuals in other Commonwealth countries, and there it stays. And as I said, when someone challenged me as to whether it really was a constitutional convention, I said, well, it seemed like a good idea at the time.
There's a postscript to this episode. That afternoon, the Evening Post newspaper publishes an account of the previous 24 hours. The report claims that McLay and other ministers had gone to Muldoon and threatened to resign. It's true that had been considered at the meeting the night before, but only very briefly before being thrown out.
If that had happened, he would have been the government and he could have done or not done whatever he wished.
Muldoon calls McLay back to his office.
He said, well, what did you plan to do? So I told him. And I said, we planned to tell the Governor-General to dismiss you and appoint me. That was the essence of it.
The fury is all over Muldoon's face.
Thunder. Yes, thunder. And it's that moment that Muldoon went after me.
Muldoon will grip desperately onto the national leadership for another 4 months, after which the caucus votes him out. McLay is elected in his place. Muldoon does not go quietly.
He led what you might call a constant effort to undermine my leadership when I became leader and never gave up. He had supporters outside Parliament. He had a group of people in Parliament who worked with him. And I guess my position probably became untenable at a certain point. But that's history.
Within 18 months, McLay is himself ousted by Jim Bolger, cheered on by Sir Rob Muldoon. On the morning of Wednesday, July 18th, 4 days after the 1984 election, a line is drawn under those days of chaos. The New Zealand dollar is devalued by 20%. Those who had found a way to shift their money out of New Zealand bring it back and enjoy a windfall. It leaves an early mark on the incoming Prime Minister.
That episode really taught me just how evil the minds of New Zealanders could be when it came to self-interest against the national interest. When given tips by Roger, they went and conducted their affairs accordingly, reckless as to the consequence to other people, unmindful of the burden on the taxpayer, concerned only with their awful, vile, mercenary advantage.
But the free market revolution is only just beginning. Before long, the dollar will be floated, chucked on the tide of global currency markets as part of a whirlwind of deregulation in the most dramatic months of economic reform New Zealand has ever seen.
We don't opt for Yugoslavian, Czechoslovakian, Polish, Hungarian models. We opt for the models of modern negotiated economy democracies.
In those days, radical reform was still possible.
It's all very well to say that we went too far.
I think once you get a momentum, it's sometimes difficult to stop it.
But my goodness me, the distance that we had to retreat from was enormous.
They couldn't believe that we'd make those changes and that they were being accepted.
You'll remember from episode 1 that Labour had contested the election armed with a vanilla economic policy, generic by design. In the first edition of the Christchurch Press after the election, the editorial was headlined, "Waiting for a Manifesto." Labour, it says, had won without having given the country any detailed idea of what it intends to do. Into that void lands a doorstopper full of details, full of ideas, from the Treasury. Ostracised from Muldoon's 9th floor, the finest financial minds on the public payroll had compiled a bumper briefing for the incoming administration. Roger Douglas likes it so much he gets it published as a book titled Economic Management. It runs to well over 300 pages. You can read it today on the Treasury website if that's what you're into. Straight after the election, Douglas gets the document directly to senior ministers.
I remember a ministerial car on the Sunday after the election came round to my house at 8 o'clock at night and delivered this huge file. And by sort of 3 o'clock in the morning when I finally finished it, I could think of no political way of handling the issues that we had. And I remember thinking to myself, well, we're going to be a 3-year government. No way we're going to get re-elected with all these issues. Oh, well, so be it. Let's make sure that we're the best government we could possibly be. And then went to sleep. When I chatted to Roger Douglas and the others who read it, they all came to the same conclusion.
They thought that we probably can't do these things and win an election.
And in a funny sort of way, that's very liberating.
But we still got to do it.
When you actually decide you're going to do what's best for the country and to hell with the polls, and we took decisions which every politician would have said was suicidal.
I'd wanted to, do these things for a long time.
And to our astonishment, instead of going down in the polls, we went up.
That Treasury briefing, economic management, is clearly a big influence. Have they been captured, got drunk on the Treasury Kool-Aid? Some think so. For left-wing columnist Bruce Jesson, it amounts to nothing less than a Treasury coup.
Yeah, I keep on hearing that, but it's totally untrue. In fact, the Treasury was stunned when they discovered what we thought.
Roger Douglas bristles at the idea they were captured by the Treasury.
But maybe I'll read from this book, okay?
Oh, yeah, please. Roger Douglas has brought into the studio a pile of papers and books. He grabs a bookmarked copy of Broken Circle, The Decline and Fall of the Fourth Labour Government, and reads aloud several passages. For example,
David Cagle notes that Roger was often the head of Treasury in his thinking, and the Treasury more than once struggled to deal with the practical implications of something in broad principle. Blah, blah, blah.
It's true that when they were in opposition, they had someone from Treasury seconded to their office, but they were all marching in time, Douglas says.
Yeah, I'm trying to be absolutely honest here. Of course they had some influence. Well, I mean, I published their paper because they have some influence the whole of New Zealand, for God's sake. But if you also ask Treasury for the papers I sent, I often sent them saying, this is what I want to do.
It's around this time that the Roger Douglas theory of change is taking form.
Quite a lot of things needed to be done. And I learned from that too that you needed to package things if you were going to be successful. And what the interest groups came to realise was that once they had lost their privilege, they all gained when someone else lost theirs.
Rogernomics, a word which will soon enter the national vocabulary, means everything, everywhere, all at once, and at pace.
I would argue you can't actually go fast enough.
According to the Douglas doctrine, you move in quantum leaps. By the time your opponents catch up with what you're doing, you're on to the next thing.
Because if you go quickly, then people don't have time, they can't adjust.
Douglas is at the apex of what comes to be known as the Troika, alongside ministers Richard Prebble and David Cagle.
We had good dynamics between the three of us. I generated the policy and the strategy, but both of those guys contributed.
I was a very close political ally of Roger Douglas and always had been. You've got to remember I was his father's campaign manager, and Roger and I had been on the Auckland Regional Council of the Labour Party together, so reasonably close friends. Asking David Cagle was very smart. Cagle came from Christchurch and represented a different section of the caucus.
Prebble had his own faction.
They were MPs who called themselves Prebs Rebs and would and were great mates and supporters.
Cagle is tasked with dismantling a lattice of price controls, 36 in total. Here he is, several years later, totting them up.
Window glass, drugs, apples and pears, bananas, canned foods, eggs, neutral spirit, oranges, sugar, frozen vegetables, aluminium, metal pipes, ceramic tableware, milk, motor vehicles, pharmaceuticals, butter, steel pipe, steel wire, flour, bran and pollard and natural gas. But I don't think that's the complete list.
After David Cagle had finished, New Zealand was the only country in the OECD that had no price control on anything. Whereas my job, I was a sort of fix-it man.
Or a hit man, wasn't it?
Well, some people would call me the hitman, kind of people would call me the fix man. But if the government was in trouble in Parliament, the whips would ring me up and say, Preb, you got to come down. And it wouldn't matter whether it's my bill or someone else's, and I would come down and try to turn things around. I've got more words in Parliament in Hansard than any other MP in history.
Inspired by the Bob Hawke example in Australia, the new government puts on a show, the Economic Summit. Lange promises an exercise in consultation.
We cannot, from some distant Wellington central authority place, devise every footfall, every step on the way. We know where we're going. We know what sort of shape we want to be in when we arrive there. And it will be with the merging of all these forces in our society, capital, labour, social worker, all the people representing the various ethnic groups, the various youth, and all the people who make up the society are going to have to make their commitment each with the other to come through. The alternative is constant regulation and failure.
Or to put it another way,
it was more a marketing exercise that we wanted the public to actually understand the gravity of the problem.
Here's Peter Harris, the former trade union economist.
As far as the government was concerned, having convened the Economic Summit, they had a blanket authority to do what they wanted, and they just proceeded to ram things through. I mean, Roger Douglas wrote in his book that the way to do things is to ram something through quickly, and while your opponents are scrambling around opposing it, get on to the next thing. So you just keep the opposition in disarray. So you've got to crash through with pace. And it was very hard for anybody to resist that. But even if you did accept that the currency crisis made a devaluation inevitable, it didn't make everything else inevitable.
What about the party? What's the mood in the Labour rank and file?
A bit anxious, I think.
This is Margaret Wilson, who has taken over as Labour Party president from Jim Anderton. He's become a backbench MP.
I mean, obviously pleased we were the government because it wasn't a national government, so that was a positive and shouldn't be denied. And there was also the possibility of change. I think the party saw that, and that was really important. So, for instance, some of the things I think people don't quite realise, the women's agenda was moved at that time. It was not only the ministry, but there was a whole lot of legislation relating to rape, the beginning of pay equity, etc. I think in terms of Maori, who are becoming really influential within the party and hopefully within the whole context in the treaty and the role of the treaty, we got real movement going there. Institutional racism named for the first time, really, in that sense. So, and that then provided platforms subsequently for things to happen. So structural change does take time. And I think what Labor was never given credit for was during that time, it did put in place some structural change.
She's got a point. Just because there's an economic hurricane rattling the windows doesn't mean there aren't a bunch of other winds blowing. For example, Geoffrey Palmer is setting in motion a series of major constitutional reforms. The push for gender equality championed by Margaret Wilson takes its most obvious form in the creation of a Ministry of Women's Affairs, led by Anne Herkes.
It will be given adequate resources for its role as an initiator, a coordinator and a monitor of activities affecting women. But I must stress it's going to be a small, high-powered and very active ministry.
For Māori, progress is slow. The occupation of Bastion Point is still fresh in memories. Kohanga Reo had been established in 1982, but its funding is frugal. As recently as the early months of 1984, telephone toll operator Nader Glavish, then Nader Povey, was reprimanded for greeting callers with the words, "Kia ora."
I find it very hard to understand why I should have to defend a salutation of this country to fellow New Zealanders, to fellow countrymen. I have nothing against good morning or good day or hello. Kia ora is me, part of me.
A few weeks after the Economic Summit, another gathering is held at Parliament, focused on Māori economic development. Hui Taumata. The Minister of Māori Affairs, Koro Wetere, hails a turning point for the Māori people.
We must act now to lift the economic and social status of our people. Time is running out. Options are closing. New Zealand cannot progress without our people, nor at their expense.
Among those at the Hui Taumata are rangatahi who will go on to become MPs. Parekura Horomia, Elizabeth Kerekere, and Hekia Parata.
Oh my God. Is this Hui Taumata? Oh, I can't even remember what I said. That was amazing, that event.
Māori people. The media does its best to tell us that the average Māori is a young, unemployed, homeless glue sniffer whose recreation is robbing, raping and vandalising. Well, I'm here to tell you that we aren't. Those people are simply casualties of a system which doesn't accommodate us. We are constantly battered with statistics. Māori people are amongst the lowest paid, have one of the highest unemployment rates, some of the greatest health problems, highest crime rate, and so on. Having been told all this ad nauseum, I think we would be justified in expecting that government departments dealing with these areas should be turned over to Māori people to deal with the so-called Māori problems.
Well, I mean, I could give that speech again today. Not much has changed. I mean, there's still this whole pathology or pathologising of being Māori, and the idea of devolution, of creating the conditions in which people can make decisions for themselves because they know themselves better than, a group of government departments in Wellington, and that's true for any region, but it's certainly true for Māori and for iwi, in their own areas.
That 1984 hui did, however, change things, Parata says.
I think that it created, or at least picked up, momentum and energy by iwi about what they could and should be doing in terms of economic development as a basis for our own, social improvement and the strength of our cultural infrastructure, if you like. It set the seeds, I think, for moving quite quickly towards the treaty settlement approach, because how could you have economic development if you had all your resources still alienated from you? So I think it was a watershed moment in general Māori development and in the understanding by government that there was an opportunity to partner.
When the Waitangi Tribunal had been set up in 1975, it was tasked with looking at contemporary claims over potential treaty breaches. One of the early acts of this new Labour government is to fundamentally extend the tribunal's remit, to investigate treaty claims dating back to 1840. The change is led by Koro Wetere and Geoffrey Palmer.
I remember when we passed that legislation, I got more mail criticising it than anything else I ever did. But it seems to me it's worn rather well over the number of settlements that have been reached under both parties. It's extraordinary. It is binding on New Zealand as a matter of international law. I mean, the treaty was done by the British government. We inherited the power from them when we became independent. It's binding on us. It's an international treaty. It's probably binding as a matter of contract as well. And the idea that you can ignore it or change it isn't really very viable.
To the future, we want to contribute because we have, in today's jargon, heaps to give. Nō reira o ku pakeke, o ku kaumātua, o ku whanaunga hoa, tēnā rawa atu koutou.
In that heady early chapter of government, Labour is polling strongly. Lange is flourishing.
He was on top of things and he was enjoying himself.
This is Roger Douglas.
During those early months, we'd have the cabinet meeting in the morning and then we'd have a cabinet lunch. Lange would go down to the theatre and the reporters would come. Lange would come back to the lunch and entertain us. And I mean entertain us, the cabinet, with what he'd said at the press conference. Harman said this, and it was, he could remember every word virtually. So it was fun, and he was enjoying it.
When he was at his best, he was just stunningly good.
That's Stephen Mills.
He was just a brilliant communicator, in terms of just handling the media directly. Those press conferences of his became he should have sold tickets. There was so much demand to be at them.
It simply meant that I have a very reliable, competent,
diligent deputy. I have a team of finance ministers that can be relied on utterly. There are people in the social welfare and all these other portfolios who are just totally resourceful. I can't think of a government, as objectively as I can think of this in recent time, that has had that measure of competence in it.
The next big test for Lange and Douglas and the Labour government is the budget. It's been bumped back to November because of the winter snap election.
Morning report, 4 minutes past 7. The Minister of Finance, Roger Douglas, unveiled his first budget in Parliament last night. Our political editor, De Griffin, says Mr Douglas didn't just pull an economic rabbit from the hat. He released some pretty fierce financial measures for his new economic deal.
On the farming front, the government's gone for broke, an analogy that might have unfortunate connotations for some marginal farmers. The administration swept aside the majority of agricultural subsidies and support systems in a move designed to force the producers to stand on their own feet. In an equally determined manner, the budget has slashed subsidies on a spectrum of services.
Labour's direction of travel had been clear enough in the months after the election, but here it all comes together. A motherlode of reforms, an inferno of regulations, and a plan to fundamentally restructure the tax system with a brand new Goods and Services Tax, GST. Don Brash would later call it probably the world's first example of a Big Bang approach to reform. In the space of just 8 months, by Roger Douglas's reckoning, New Zealand surges from the most regulated to the least regulated country in the developed world. Bob Jones loves it.
I suppose it's going to be tough on some fellows. There's going to be bankruptcies. But by God, it's sensible stuff. We haven't had it in half a century.
Even Jim Anderton, the leftist of the left in caucus, gives the budget a pass mark.
I think Mr Douglas and his ministers have done a very good job under very difficult circumstances, but I think they would be the first to concede that nothing could be perfect under these circumstances, and I think there will need to be a reassessment and an appraisal of the impact as the full effects of the budget become clearer.
In its coverage of the budget, Radio New Zealand's Morning Report enlists some other experts, the characters of the sitcom Gliding On.
What do John, Jim and Beryl think about the news? John sees the taxing of fringe benefits as a bit of a giggle.
We don't actually get company perks in the public service, so it looks like a bit of a clean sweep, eh?
So, Beryl, how do you think the budget's going to hit you and Mum?
Well, that thing about the sherry, how much did you say it was?
57 cents more.
57 cents? Mrs Whittaker and Mum are going to be very upset about that.
Roger Hall's Gliding On inhabits the spirit of its times, a gentle satire of a beige, plump, wasteful public service. What John, Jim and Beryl don't know is that the Troika Juggernaut is about to come for them. By the end of 1984, discontent is brewing.
Economic moves announced in the budget brought bitter attacks on the government from farmers, low-income groups without children, the unemployed and superannuitants.
And the party is pushing back. In April 1985, about the time Roger Douglas is being awarded the Euromoney Magazine Award for Finance Minister of the Year, Labour holds its South Island Regional Conference in Westport. Jim Anderton leads the charge against the free market agenda.
I think there's an imbalance there at the moment that is hurting very badly, particularly those who probably are least able to cope with it.
Peter Harris is there on behalf of the unions.
There were lots of resolutions on the floor, more or less trying to rein in different aspects of the Rogernomics agenda. But what the Labour leadership did was to conflate it all into voter confidence in the government around GST. And the hard line was laid down by Prebble and Palmer, and you've got to vote for this, otherwise it's a vote of no confidence in the party, and you are the party, and all that sort of stuff. The real triple whip laid on. The votes were quite evenly poised, and eventually the Hotel Workers Union threw its lot in with Douglas, and that got the vote over the line. And after that, they said, well, we've got the mandate now, let's go.
But it's pretty clear the honeymoon is coming to an end. Across the road from the conference hall, on an unemployed workers' centre fence, are painted the words, Roger Douglas loves Maggie Tea.
We have not been as our political predecessors, favourers of some sections. All have felt it.
This is Lange in an interview marking the first year of the Labour government. He agrees that yes, there have been some speed wobbles.
And we've taken heed of that, and we don't have now the need for that pace of change. We've come out of the rapids, and we're going through a bit of the lake.
But the last thing that Roger Douglas is interested in is a nice cruise on the lake. He's racing towards deeper, faster white waters. The giddy momentum and scale of the reforms have been made possible by a cocktail of factors. Muldoon had been desperately blocking a dam that was bound to burst its banks. The snap election has short-circuited the policy process, and the hydra-headed crisis in the days after the election delivered an urgent, almost manic energy. But there's another ingredient in that perfect storm.
As the new government carves out an economic policy for itself that looks far more like the right-wing policies of Thatcher or Reagan than the socialism officially supported by the Labour Party, it's moved New Zealand's foreign relations onto a new, more left footing.
The next chapter in the story of the Lange government is epic in its own right. New Zealand clashing with the United States over nukes, the birth of a new nationalism, and a shocking act of foreign state terrorism in the waters of Auckland. That's next, in episode 3 of Juggernaut, the story of the fourth Labour government. Juggernaut, the story of the fourth Labour government, is written and presented by me, Toby Manhire, for the Spin-Off Podcast Network, made with the support of New Zealand On Air. The producer is Sophie Dowson, the audio editor and sound designer is Tiahe Butler, the researchers are Hannah Lou and Rachel Judkins, the graphic designer is Archie Banal, and the executive producers are Duncan Grieve and Jane Yee. Archival audio in this episode is from the RNZ collection at Ngā Taonga Sound and Vision. You can read a full list of sources and a bunch of other written material that digs deeper into the story by clicking the link in the show notes. Thanks to Steve Russell, Finlay McDonald, Amber Easby, Mad Chapman, Anna Rafferty-Connell, Jen Follett, Isaiah Tua, Ben Fagan, Bernard Hickey, and everyone who made the time to speak with us. Kia ora, this is Toby Manhire. Thank you for listening to Juggernaut. I hope you're enjoying this series. A lot of work from a small but talented group of people went into making this podcast, and we're extremely grateful to New Zealand On Air for supporting the project. It also couldn't have happened without the support of our members. If you like what we do here at the Spin-Off and would like to see more projects like Juggernaut out in the world, then please consider becoming a Spin-Off member. Visit thespinoff.co.nz/members to help us do more of the work you value.
Are you making the most of your KiwiSaver investment? Generate is an award-winning KiwiSaver provider with a track record of strong long-term performance. Making a smart decision now could add tens of thousands of dollars by the time you reach retirement. Book a no-obligation chat with a Generate KiwiSaver advisor today at generatekiwisaver.co.nz/get-advice. A copy of the product disclosure statement is available at generatekiwisaver.co.nz. The issuer of the scheme is Generate Investment Management Limited, and of course, past performance does not guarantee future returns.
The Spin-Off Podcast Network.